Hello, my friends. It's me, Mrs. Surrett, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Progressive Era, which was a time period of great change for the workers, and a time where worker protections began to become more common. The Progressive Era was really not just about political but also social reform, trying to make life better for everyone involved. And it has these four main goals that you're going to see as we talk about some of what happened in that time. One was the idea of the purification of government, getting rid of corruption, getting rid of graft, no more political machines and bosses that can tell you how to vote or where to live. They're trying to bring democracy to the people, the idea that the people can make the decisions, and it's no longer in the hands of the politicians or the business leaders. Prohibition was a big one during this time, banning alcoholic beverages. Of course, during this time period, there was a feeling that alcohol was causing a lot of the problems, workers showing up drunk and getting themselves hurt, rowdy immigrants who were partying too much. That was a big one. And of course, as we know, prohibition, it helps, but it kind of backfires in that it brings about bootlegging and organized crime. So that was sort of a political machine, but nothing's perfect. Women's suffrage, the idea of this pure female vote, women being incorruptible angels who could bring about a sense of purity to the government. And building an efficiency movement. This was a big one, and it sometimes seems sort of silly because you think about progressives being there to help people, but really, truly, the idea of modernizing the old way of doing things and making it safer, but also more scientific and efficient. So, for example, Henry Ford was a great example of this one. He wanted to build a car that could be afforded by more people. The problem was the cars of the time, a couple people worked on them. It took them days, weeks, even months to build. They were bulky. They were hard to pay for because they were very expensive because it cost so much to make them. So he came up with the idea of the assembly line. Instead of each person making, I'll do the door and then tomorrow I'll do the window and then I'll do the trunk. I have one job now on the assembly line. My job is to put on that little rear view mirror. Okay, so every car that comes by, I attach a rear view mirror. And it's coming now. Instead of having to walk over and get it, now it comes to me on a moving line. And the thing is, not only does he have me put on that rear view mirror, but then he actually goes in and has people film me and take pictures of me, and they say, oh, you know what, you're wasting time because you have to keep reaching way over here for your tool. You should keep it closer. You should already have this shined up. You should be shining it up before the car gets to you so that that mirror is already shiny. So they start to watch my process and make it quicker and faster. So the idea of bringing science and engineering into these problems that people were facing. Now, the goals of the progressives were pretty simple. As I mentioned, we talked about science, we talked about using science and making your movements faster and quicker. Well, that's kind of conserving your resources. If I have to constantly walk across the room to go find this pen, it's going to take me forever if I want to write something down. If I keep this pen right next to me, that sounds silly, but it conserves my movements. It conserves my energy. But also there was the conservation of natural resources. The idea that, for all the trees we cut down, the land we mow over and create buildings, we've got to protect some of that land and to keep some of those beautiful natural areas around. They accepted industry. They knew that they couldn't get rid of it. The populists were like, well, no, we'll just get rid of industry. We won't let it grow. And the progressives said, all right, look, big business is there and it needs to grow because without it, we don't have jobs and we don't have an economy. But we can protect people. And immigration is okay too. They said, we can work with the immigrants. We can help them to assimilate and become more comfortable with our culture. They wanted to improve the lives of the industrial worker, whether or not they were native or immigrant, but they wanted to bring better lives to these people and to make their lives less bleak. They also wanted to bring safety to the workplace. Women's suffrage, I mentioned. Bringing reform and order to the United States. Prohibition, I mentioned. Democratic reforms I'll talk about in just a second. But basically what they're trying to do is to impose some kind of order and rules on capitalism. Remember, before this, the big thing in capitalism was laissez-faire. Laissez-faire was the idea that the government's just going to step back and they're just going to let business run it and business will be fine, which is great for the guys at the top. But for all these workers, it's horrible. So they're saying, okay, look, we'll let you do a lot of what you want to do, but you've got to remember your workers. You've got to think about these people and you've got to help them out. So let me talk a little bit about democratic reform. There was some big things that we kind of take for granted today that are a big deal. And one was the secret ballot. When I go and I vote for president, no one should know who I vote for unless I choose to tell you. That's my business. But before these reforms, people would tell them, say, when you would go to vote, you'd kind of be in this middle of this big open area and you'd put your vote in and they could see which vote you chose and what you wrote down. And so you might have someone saying to you, hey, you better vote for this guy or you're out of a job. Well, now they were saying, let's have a secret ballot. No one needs to know how each other voted. And this was very important because it meant that people could vote their conscience more. The idea of an initiative. Instead of letting Congress be the one to decide whether or not something should be passed into a law, the citizens can propose and pass this law. This is a big deal because if there's a feeling, for example, that you need to put some kind of safety rule into place, but the people who own the place are like, no, we don't want the safety rule because it'll take away from our profits. Well, the initiative allows the citizens to propose that law and then pass it, which forces it into law. A referendum. Sometimes the laws Congress wanted to propose, they weren't very good laws. So referendums give the voters the right to decide if that law should be passed. Recalls. Some government officials, shocking I know, were very corrupt, very dishonest. In a recall, the voters could say, we want this guy to lose his job. And then, of course, direct primaries. When we have presidential primaries, for example, like we just had the Iowa caucus, the New Hampshire primary I think is about to happen or just did, the idea is that the people get to decide who should be the candidates to run for office instead of the politicians. So the politicians may really like this guy because he's dishonest, but the people don't, so the people get to make that decision. So these are really, really big reforms of that time period. Now, there were some people pushing for social change, and they were called muckrakers. They were investigative journalists, and their job was to expose the waste and the corruption and the scandals that were going on. And I'm going to talk about these three in just a moment. But why were they doing this? They wanted to encourage change. They're trying to put pressure on the government to regulate businesses and stop the abuses that were going on. So the first muckraker, I'm going to talk about Upton Sinclair, and I hope you've already had lunch. Upton Sinclair exposed the unsanitary and dangerous conditions of the meat packing industry. Here you can just see the meat is just laying out. It could lay out for a couple days before they finally packaged it up and sent it out. You can see people working on machines, and these machines might be very sharp or dangerous. People could get hurt working with these machines. There were rats that were all over the meat, and sometimes the rats kind of got mixed in with the meat. Like I said, eat lunch first. You might also have Ida Tarbell, or you did have Ida Tarbell, who revealed the illegal means that John D. Rockefeller was using to make Standard Oil Company a monopoly. And you can see this political cartoon where he has his fingers and all of or it's sort of like an octopus, has his arms and everything, including the White House and other political businesses, which would force people to give him what he wanted. Jacob Riis, he documented the poverty and terrible living conditions of many factory workers in the city. Here you can see some orphan children just sleeping out in the cold on the corner because that's the only place they had to sleep. You might have 15, 20, 30 people shoved into a one-room apartment because that's all they could afford. So what changes happened as a result? Well, in terms of Upton Sinclair, and the meat packing. There's the Roosevelt Commission, who actually goes in and they look at what Sinclair was saying and they say, oh my gosh, he's right. This is disgusting. This meat is horrible. So he pushes for the Meat Inspection Act. In 1906, this law was designed to set very strict cleanliness requirements for meat packing and to allow federal inspection of meat packing programs. It also creates the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is basically to stop the sale of contaminated meat. I mean, people would sell meat that was spoiled and bad, and they wouldn't care. Oh, you got sick. Well, that just stinks to be you. So he's trying to stop that, and he wants to make sure that whatever it says on the label is actually what you're getting in the food, because sometimes that didn't always happen. For the workers, especially the poor, the children, and the women, a movement became known as the settlement houses. And I'm going to talk about who really started that in a moment. But settlement houses were, the idea behind it was you would go into a poor urban neighborhood, which was in the city, and you would convert these residential buildings to a place where people could come to live. They would have a place to stay. They would also have a place to participate in art classes or playgrounds, sport camps, having clean milk stations where you could get milk for your children, well baby clinics. And the idea was that the middle class would volunteer and work and live here with the poor and kind of show them that there was a way out, show them stepping stones that they could move on and get something more with their life. And the idea was to improve the lives of poor people and offer these amenities and services that the government wasn't offering. It leads to a new field of social work, which we use today. And it was really developed by Jane Addams. She was a really big leader in this. And it was just trying to help these people move on to the next level, see that there was more to their lives. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr worked together to co-found the Hull House, which was probably the biggest and most well-known of the settlement houses, and it was considered the cutting edge of reform for both the immigrants and the poor. Again, they're not distinguishing between native-born and not, immigrants. They're anybody who's poor could come here. But Jane Addams really was a leader in the settlement house movement. Now, some people were so impressed with this, for example, one particular governor, that they actually tried to apply it at a statewide level. Governor Robert La Follette of Wisconsin decided to take these ideas of assaulting these monopolies, getting rid of them, getting clean government, using scientific management in your government, and he puts this whole program together to create this brand new system of government in Wisconsin. And it was so amazing. You can see the picture here before, and he's being strangled by big business, and after, here's this clean, nice little girl on her way to school, that other governors were just so blown away by this that some reform-minded governors began to apply it to their states. So this progressive movement has far-reaching implications. Teddy Roosevelt was a big progressive leader. He became president when McKinley was shot, and he kind of created the modern presidency as we know it. For one thing, he's the one who supported federal government getting involved if the states weren't able to fix their problems. And he called it his square deal, the idea of these reforms, and that he was going to be square or honest with people. But his big thing was conservation. He was big on conserving national parks, national lands, and he wanted to protect these wilderness areas for the common good. The idea of the Grand Canyon, I'm trying to think of some other places and I'm going blank. Yellowstone, a lot of these were his babies. And he was able to make 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests. So that's pretty good. So let me mention 2 presidents here. The first, as we were talking about, was President Roosevelt, and his reform movement was known as New Nationalism. Again, the idea of that logo or catchphrase was kind of his. He believed that the federal government must be a steward of the public welfare. Guys, this is so important, a steward of the public welfare. He said it's our job to protect things for the next generation. So he worked to improve the conditions for women and children. He worked for workers' compensation laws. If you get hurt on the job, your job should pay for it. He worked for greater restriction on corporations. And he also believed in the ideas of inheritance and income tax, different ways to fund these programs. President Wilson came not after Roosevelt, but after the president after him. So it was Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson. His was called the New Freedom, and he was really desiring to accomplish an effective government response to social and economic issues. Not just talk, but actually have the government do something about these problems. So he wanted to break up monopolies, restrict child labor. He wanted a graduated income tax, and he created the Federal Reserve Act, which helped with banking, and the Federal Trade Commission, which investigated and prosecuted unfair business practices and trading practices. So we see the progressive movement really taking hold, the idea of helping out those who have less and who need more protections taking hold in this time period. I'll be back in a little bit to talk to you about women's reform.